issues related to inequality and democracy in Ireland and the EU. Climate justice is a new stream of work for us, but it's extraordinarily relevant today, especially for issues around inequality, though that's not often thought as part of work on climate action. Today's event focuses in particular on a European-led model, community-led local development. It asks questions about the relevance for Ireland and the relevance of the concept for Ireland, particularly in regards to climate action and protecting biodiversity. In the past, we've had the LEADER program, and that is ending, that ended last year. Ireland did not opt into that funding for whatever reasons. What we're asking today is whether or not Ireland should engage in that funding going forward, particularly because the pandemic has shown how important collective action is in regulating not just a health crisis, but also issues like climate action, job creation, maintaining communities. So the panel today will discuss not just the concept of community-led local development, but also its relevance for Ireland and whether or not the government should choose to opt into this funding stream going forward. I don't want to take up any more of your time, so I'm going to introduce Sean, who again is leading our climate justice work at TASC. Thanks, Sean.
Thank you, Shana, and thanks everyone for joining us. Delighted to be hosting this second Spending Better event, which really is looking at as we build back in our just recovery, how do we consider the use of public funds that are available to us, and can we I suppose offer a thank you to the communities that have been so put upon by the pandemic, but also have responded so strongly. Delighted to be joined today by Minister Joe O'Brien, Minister of State at the Department of Rural and Community Development, with special responsibility for community development and charities, a role he has been in since July 2020. Padraig Casey, Economic Development Manager at Ballyhura Development CLG, and member of the Irish Local Development Network, who helped co-organise this event, and a significant thank you is owed to both Padraig and Joe Saunders. Marion Eckert, President of the European Leader Association for Rural Development, a network of 26 members with more than 220 local action groups working across contexts of rural, coastal, urban and peri-urban communities. And Marion joined us at the 11th hour, so we're very grateful that Marion was able to make it. And Jack O'Connor, Trade Unionist, Chair of the Labour Party and a member of the European Economic and Social Committee. This is quite an informal conversation. We want to raise awareness of the opportunities presented by the EU's CLLD, Community-Led Local Development Multi-Fund approach. And we're only going to take a short amount of time this morning. It's the idea of these events is that they're a coffee morning, a coffee chat. So we'll get straight into it. And maybe Minister O'Brien, we might come to you first, just to ask, you've had nearly a year under your belt now in the department, and it's been a year of incredible challenge due to the pandemic, but also shone a light on the capacity of communities to work together and overcome significant challenges. Maybe you might offer some reflections on that first year and your thoughts on the importance and the future of community leadership.
Thank you, Sean, and good morning to everyone, and delighted to be with you all this morning to engage on the topic of community-led local development. Firstly, before I address your question, just to thank TASC and ILDN as well for, again, I suppose, selecting a topic that we need to shed a bit of light on, and for facilitating an informed kind of public discussion as well. You do it well, so thank you for doing it on this topic, which I have to say I have learned quite a bit about in recent times as well. But to address your question, yeah, it's been an extraordinary year in a whole variety of respects, but I think from a community point of view, I think community organisations have really stepped up to the plate over the last year, and I'm really glad and relieved in a way, as someone who's worked in the sector all my life up until getting elected, that that value has now been proven in my eyes anyway, and I suppose I see part of my role as making sure all my other colleagues in government see what the community sector has done over the last 12 months as well. But I think it's been officially acknowledged. I mean, NESC did an assessment of the Community Call initiative, which was basically a nationwide ground-up collaboration between community groups and local authorities and various state agencies as well, in response to the pandemic. And that report has kind of officially acknowledged that there was huge value gained in that, and it's value that I am very interested in retaining and building on as well. And we hope to gather some stakeholders from the Community Call initiative later this year to discuss how we can build on the new collaborations, but also that success in reaching people who weren't previously reached, I suppose, as well. So there's quite a lot of value to be built upon it. So it's been challenging, but I think that the sector has showed its value, I think. So and maybe to come more to today, I'm not an expert on CLD, but I will offer some perspectives and context I think that might inform some of the discussion and Q&A here today, and others can talk with more experience and expertise about the specific impacts and potential of CLD, I think. So in the European Commission's words, community-led local development is a term to describe an approach that turns traditional top-down development policy on its head, local people taking the reins and forming a local partnership that designs and implements an integrated development strategy. So I always just like to open with being clear about what we're talking about, because terminology can be very contested in this area as well, and what we're talking about when we mean community development is contested sometimes as well. But CLD is an EU endorsed approach on the local use of European structural and investment funds, led by local action groups composed of reps from local public and private socioeconomic interests. And I've had a few conversations with some people ahead of today's event to get different perspectives on CLD. And it's very clear to me that today's event is needed to inform, to open a discussion, perhaps make linkages, relationships and collaborations, but perhaps also to rail against the risk of siloed thinking and siloed working as well. The 2014 to 2020 EU programming period allowed for CLLD to be supported not just by the European Agricultural Fund for Rural Development, but also supported by the European Regional Development Fund, the European Social Fund, and the European Maritime Fisheries Fund, all of which operate under a common framework under ESI funds. In Ireland, CLLD is used in delivery of the LEADER programme under the European Agriculture Fund for Rural Development and the funding for fisheries local action groups, the FLAGs, in the delivery of the European Maritime Fisheries Fund. However, in the Irish context, the use of CLLD is mainly seen in our LEADER programme, and the LEADER programme, which celebrates 30 years in Ireland this year, has been following this CLLD approach for quite some time. Just to explain a little bit why I'm the one talking to you today, the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine is the managing authority for these funds, and the Department of Rural and Community Development, the RCD, where I am based, is the delegated paying agency with responsibility for LEADER. So that's part of the reason why I'm the one talking to you. Now, Ireland does not operate a multi-fund CLD approach. Instead, a mono-fund approach was adopted to CLLD in each of the funds, the rural development and the fisheries one, and they remain separate in that way. And this is one of the core points that we are interested in exploring today. And indeed, as mentioned already, I think the event is timely as there is downward pressure on CAP at the European level, and the European Agriculture Fund for Rural Development, which funds LEADER, is one of the two pillars of CAP, of course. If rumours of a further drop in the LEADER allocation and CAP are true, this could diminish CLLD opportunities in Ireland, so it's a good time to discuss CLLD. I would also say that it's also a potential opportunity to discuss not just if the CLLD approach could be expanded, but also perhaps improved. And in some recent conversations I had, some felt that there was some room for improvement in that regard as well. More broadly speaking, as Minister for State, I have responsibility for the implementation of our national 5-year strategy for the development of the community and voluntary sector as a whole. Now, I don't want to overload you with jargon on what the objectives of that strategy are, but one of the key focuses of the strategy is to support and build capacity of local community groups to be more involved in decision-making processes that impact them. So you can see why I'm interested in CLD. We are doing some practical work in terms of capacity building. Priority for 2021 is to carry out a needs analysis of the community and voluntary sector with 3 priority groups identified. Firstly, and this is actively ongoing, members of the LCDCs, the local community development committees, which are relevant for LEADER. Secondly, board members of voluntary organisations, and then smaller community and voluntary groups as well. And we hope to be completed that assessment of the LCDC's training needs next month. And in a very broad sense, I'm very supportive of approaches that situate decision-making about resource allocation and local development in the community, or to use the phrase, at the lowest effective level. And again, CLLD, I think, is important in this regard. And also the commitment to bottom-up approaches is reflected in our commitment in the programme for government to introduce new pilot community development projects. And here the terminology now gets sort of used twice for somewhat different things. But we recently had a call for applications for the new community development projects. Pilot programme has been opened to community development organisations or groups that have relevant experience of working with marginalised individuals and groups and a proven track record in community development based on the values outlined in the strategy to support the community and the voluntary sector and the All-Ireland standards for community work. The pilot community development programme is currently at a very advanced assessment stage, and it's expected we'll be announcing the 8 successful applicants very soon. Just to clarify, this is not EU funded work, but I felt it was relevant to mention it nonetheless. But specifically in relation to the Department of Rural and Community Development, EU funding is provided through LEADER, which uses CLLD, but also the Peace Programme and the European Social Fund. And the EU Just Transition Fund is also run via the Department of Environment, and it's also worth noting that, I think. So in theory, Ireland could potentially practice CLLD through these other EU funding streams. A relevant context that I want to put out there as well is our recently published blueprint on transforming rural Ireland or rural future, the current and new rural strategy. It's supported by 150 commitments across government, which will address the challenges facing communities and deliver new opportunities for people living in rural areas. And the LEADER programme will play a key role over the lifetime of the policy, and the CLLD bottom-up, locally led community approach that has always been central to LEADER will be key to delivery of this policy. The department, along with the National Rural Network, will shortly be publishing case studies from the 2014 to 2020 programme, which will highlight the excellent, innovative projects which have been delivered over the last number of years, and I expect these will inform the transitional programme and the new programme from 2023. And just to mention briefly the transitional programme, €70 million transitional leader programme for the period to 2022, which actually came into effect this month. I'm going to skip a little bit because I know you want to keep time tight here as well. A key focus of the transitional programme will be on building capacity within communities that have not received LEADER funding to date. Investments in remote working hubs, job creation, foster and encourage entrepreneurship, while also supporting projects which address the climate agenda will be key priorities of the transitional programme and beyond. It's important to mention that the Programme for Government contains a number of commitments in relation to the LEADER programme. Amongst these commitments was to develop and deliver the transitional programme and an increase in the aid rate for private enterprises. And in announcing the details of the transitional programme and the increased rate of aid, 2 of the PFG commitments for LEADER have been completed. But crucially and relevant for today, a third commitment is to pursue extra EU funding opportunities through CLLD, and this is being progressed by officials within the department. Looking forward, as I mentioned earlier, the next LEADER programme is scheduled to begin in 2023. Drafting of the initial intervention has begun alongside engagement with stakeholders. Department of Rural and Community Development will be aligning the development of the next LEADER programme to the development of the overall CAP strategic plan, which is being managed by the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine. The EU regulatory framework governing the new CAP strategic plan has not been fully agreed yet at the EU level, and trilogue negotiations are ongoing on all aspects of the CAP programme. However, similar to the Rural Development Programme 2014 to 20, now 22 regulations, the current draft regulations provide for a minimum 5% allocation for LEADER under the next European Agricultural Fund for Rural Development. The development on the design and allocation of the next programme will continue over the remainder of this year with the current roadmap, planning government approval in early December and submission of the CAP strategic plan to the European Commission in January 2022. So to conclude, I look forward to the other inputs and our discussion here today. I will be listening very carefully to the viewpoints of my fellow panelists. I'm very interested to understand from their perspective how adopting the CLLD methodology to other European funding streams could result in better outcomes, and how perhaps the panelists feel that Ireland could overcome some of the challenges associated with multi-funded CLLD. From my perspective, I'll certainly consider the matters raised and bring the feedback back to the department for further consideration. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Minister, and thank you for that overview. I guess just to maybe offer a little bit of context on where we're coming from in TASC, we've been working on just transition issues and climate justice issues now for about 3 years, and about 4 or 5 months before the pandemic, I attended an event in Brussels hosted by AEIDL, a Committee on Local and Sustainable Development there, and I was approached by a gentleman who I think is a colleague of Jack O'Connor's, a man by the name of Roman Hacken, who really went through me for a shortcut in terms of like his being appalled at the fact that Ireland wasn't a member of the multi-fund approach, and I was going around talking about just transition and climate justice as he saw it, and I've come to see it, I guess, from my understanding, and I don't have as much an understanding as some of the people who will follow, but community is where all of the issues that we deal with collide, and then they get siloed, I suppose, as they go up through decision-making structures right the way up to the multilateral level where they're absolutely siloed, and really the opportunity, I guess, of the multi-fund approach is that tackling of silos that the Minister has mentioned. And I think that's particularly relevant when we're dealing with challenges as complex as climate action or just transition. Then our next speaker is Padraig Casey from Ballyhura. I'm very grateful to Padraig because he has helped me understand CLLD, and himself and Joe Saunders and Gabriel as well at ILDN. So very, very, very pleased to have him here, and he'll hopefully be able to give us an overview of what the potential advantages of adopting a CLLD multi-fund approach would be in Ireland.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Sean. And thank you, Minister, for your opening remarks. I suppose we're optimistic, just like you, of a renewed value on community development as we come out of the pandemic. And we look forward to that. And thank you for your continued support. I would like to thank Sean and TASC for inviting me on behalf of the Irish Local Development Network this morning to share some ideas with you on CLLD. It was pointed out to me earlier in the week when we met that the context on this is very complex, and I suppose any improvements, they need to be simple in order to be effective and be implemented. So I've been bearing that in mind, and I've prepared a couple of slides. So I'm just going to go over to slide share now, and bear with me a moment. So yeah, Sean has, I suppose, generously given me 10 minutes to explain the complexity and the simplicity, which I'll attempt to do. And I suppose I'm going to just give a brief look at the current Ireland EU funding environment, the community-led options that the EU is encouraging member states to use across the 2021 to 2027 period, what that change might look like in practice, and finally, why we should consider change at all and what impact that might have. So if you look at the current environment, I suppose the EU provides funding for a broad range of projects and programs, and it covers areas such as regional and urban development, employment and social inclusion, agriculture and rural development, maritime fisheries, innovation, the environment, climate change. But I suppose overall, about 76% of the total EU budget is managed in partnership with member states. And that's through a system of shared management, and it's largely through 5 large structural funds. And collectively, these structural funds and their operational programs, they form a 7-year partnership agreement between the EU and each member state. So the funds of relevance to Ireland are the European Regional Development Fund, the European Social Fund, the European Agricultural Fund for Rural Development, and the European Maritime and Fisheries Fund. And I suppose these programs, they provide investment in economic, in social and environmental infrastructure and services right across the state. However, and I suppose I've tried to depict it there, is they're largely, I suppose, implemented in silos. Each of them has a lead department, managing authorities, paying agents, delivery partners, audit and reporting services. But the focus today on LEADER and CLLD, I suppose that's funded right now in Ireland as a percentage of the European Agricultural Fund for Rural Development. So it's within that programme. LEADER is 30 years old this year, and so it's well tried and it's well tested at this point. And I suppose over that time, Ireland has been noted for its strong delivery of community-led development, and particularly in Ireland, the capacity of Irish communities to lead and deliver valuable local projects. It's the envy of many countries. So what changes are the EU looking to encourage member states to use? Given Leader's success as a citizen-led participative model of inclusive development, the EU determined that for the 2014 to 2020 period, it should have a wider adoption. And I suppose it evolved into what is known now as community-led local development, or CLLD in short. So I'm trying not to use acronyms, but I will use CLLD in preference to community-led local development throughout. The thing about CLLD is it retains the three interconnected elements of Leader. So you've got your local action groups, which are representatives of public, private and local socioeconomic interests. You've got the integrated local development strategies, and you've got very well-defined territories. And as well as that, it also retains the 7 basic principles of bottom-up, place-based development that are synonymous with Leader over the last 30 years. However, I suppose the difference between Leader and CLLD, and it is a very important difference because it has potential to add great value, is that CLLD is a more tightly integrated approach, and it's got a diversified funding model. And I suppose that's critical because firstly, the integrated approach, that allows your local action groups to facilitate and deal with more complex development challenges. It can be cooperation between rural and urban areas, fisheries and coastal communities, social inclusion and cohesion, employment and skills development, the environmental crisis, climate change, economic development, and essential services for residents. So a much broader range of policy areas where citizen engagement and leadership can add real value. And secondly, then the diversified financing model. While Leader traditionally, it was funded from the European Agricultural Fund for Rural Development, CLLD may be funded across the range of EU structural funds, including the Regional Development Fund, the Social Fund, and the Fisheries Fund. Now, in 2014, I suppose this was probably the last time this conversation arose. Ireland opted not to take up that multi-fund approach at that point. I suppose at the time it stuck with what it knew, and it was one of 8 member states that opted to continue to fund Leader purely out of agricultural rural development. Europe is again encouraging and putting in place supportive regulations to facilitate member states to integrate CLLD into their social fund, their development fund, their agriculture and fisheries fund over the next 7 years. And I suppose by applying that CLLD approach, you get a rural, an urban, a peri-urban areas, and it covers, I suppose, each area of all of the country. But you can also combine different kinds of measures from the different funds in order to really achieve integrated development. And I suppose Europe is pushing this because it sees it as very important to confront the social consequences of the economic crisis, and I suppose most recently the pandemic. But also that fight against poverty and exclusion and climate justice, and to facilitate a kind of a citizen engaged transition. And that transition to economic, social and environmental resource efficiency will become really important. So the option, and I suppose the decision again this time, is open to Ireland to fund CLLD from a single fund, the agricultural fund, or from a combination of all 4 structural funds. What that might look like in practice, I suppose, unlike 2014, this time around, Ireland has experience of understanding how other countries have adopted it and adapted it over the last 7 years. It's been found by many countries to be really useful for increasing integration of funding streams, and many countries really reporting improved ability to respond to local needs by being able to choose broader strategies and fund those strategies across the 4 different funds. And I suppose indications at this point are that most member states will continue to take up a CLLD multi-funded approach for the next 7 years. Ireland now knows the full value of each of our structural funds, and there's a range of other funds such as Just Transition, the Territorial Cooperation, the Recovery and Resilience Fund, and we have all of those figures at this point. So we're getting a better picture of what the overall funding landscape looks like for the next 7 years. I suppose in practice, what would be required to be looking at a multi-funded approach and how might it work in Ireland? I suppose the first thing is you're really looking at a formation of a CLLD cross-department steering group to guide a common understanding of CLLD between local and national levels, and also to examine the regulatory, the administration, the capacity challenges, and to break down those siloed systems that have operated across each of the structural funds for the last couple of decades. I suppose secondly, then you're looking at each of those operational programs for each of the structural funds, and you're trying to piece out what priorities in those within each operational program would be suitable for community-led delivery. And that's a really important piece, because I suppose, the community-led delivery isn't going to deliver the entirety of any operational program, but there are pieces within all of them where communities can add real value. This time around, to ease the administrative burden, Europe is allowing one lead department to harmonise administrative rules across the CLLD funds. So in effect, you have a lead CLLD strategy and a lead department and a lead fund, and all of the funds operating to that department's rules. So that should, in theory, make the administrative burden easier. But I suppose you're also looking at that one lead department to look at the strategy development, the implementation, the oversight, the monitoring, and the reporting. The development of place-based local development strategies will always remain important in a CLLD approach, but this time around it would have actions that would cross-cut various structural funds and be much wider in their targeting. And then at a local level, you're looking at a local action group as a multi-level, multi-issue local development agency. And I suppose in effect, its role is to mediate that top-down, bottom-up initiatives and provide a one-stop shop for community-led engagement and a catalyst for kind of strategic development in each area. And finally, if Ireland was moving to that scenario, I suppose there's a couple of very important building blocks, and transparency and better communication, both upwards and downwards in the implementation chain to facilitate trust really needs to be part of that. And that's trust at all levels, in particular building trust across key departments, managing authorities, paying agencies, local action groups, and that's to help overcome the administrative complexities of CLLD. But also that trust with communities is really important, because CLLD has to remain firmly anchored and rooted in local needs and assets if it's to be effective. Finally, I suppose, why should we consider change as a country, and what impact that might have? I suppose from my perspective and from ILDN's, my colleagues' perspectives, we work with dedicated and passionate volunteers on a daily basis, and they're contributing their skills and their experience across the country in every community, whether urban and rural. Everybody on this call knows them and quite likely are some of those key volunteers. That local volunteer effort, it drives on with playgrounds at community centres, recreation, biodiversity, climate action, renewable energy, inclusion and integration initiatives, enterprise centres, social enterprise services, the entire broad range of what goes on in communities. And the activities are endless. And it really never ceases to amaze us that the level of voluntary and the capacity of volunteers in Ireland. And I suppose that's the why. Ireland benefits from a huge social capital in every community, and we can't really afford to take it for granted. These groups of volunteers, they want to make a real difference. They don't get involved because they love processes and administration, or because they need more registrations and regulations in their life. They get involved because they really want to make their communities better places to live and work. And I suppose I and my colleagues in ILDN believe that it's in all of our interests to nurture that social capital and facilitate its valuable contribution in the most effective and efficient way possible. And what better way to do that than to reward that really vibrant activity than to create a national community-led recovery fund of a size and of a scale that can really drive locally led social innovation that will really be required over the next decade. So the overall impact of CLLD would, a multi-funded approach would really be creating a genuine bottom-up approach across a broader range of eligible activities and allowing for increased policy integration and increased synergies across key different policy areas for the state. There would certainly be a lot of improved capacity building and allowing us to target urban and rural areas, and a better and more integrated experience and progression for people supported. So you're not dealing with people in silos, you're giving them the overall holistic experience. The possibility of reducing the administration burden and simplifying the beneficiaries' experience by providing a one-stop shop and creating economies of scale in citizen engagement, communication, and implementation efforts are really valuable effects of a multi-funded CLLD. You're building on. You're not creating something new. You're building on existing leader experience, but you're also building on the existing experience across all of the structural funds, which have been, operating effectively for quite a while. But there certainly is scope to improve how they deliver. You're increasing funding for local development. You're broadening that local partnerships. You're allowing more social innovation and citizen engagement, and you're benefiting all levels of governance. You're really allowing citizens to engage right across the policy areas from a bottom-up approach. And I suppose there really that when you have that citizen engagement at that level, you will have a lot better implementation on a whole range of citizen-led actions. And ultimately, I suppose you progressing towards your sustainable development goals and the outcomes that Ireland wants to achieve from those. So finally, just to say, I suppose this morning is all about having the conversation. We need to have a conversation, but it needs to be grounded in the possibilities and the opportunities. And we need to look forward and towards establishing kind of long-term structures and supports around citizen engagement and citizen-led development. So that was a brief overview. I'm not sure, did I stick to my 10 minutes, Sean? But thank you all for listening, and I look forward to the discussions that follow.
Timekeeping was perfect, Badr. Thanks a million, and thank you for such a thought-provoking presentation. It's complex. I think that's one piece of this challenge that we face, but also just from initial reflections of our work on the people's transition in Ardra and in Phibsborough, communities are complex places with contestation and with different priorities within them, and I think having that holistic approach that we're talking about here can only lead to better outcomes. In terms of the complexity, in terms of the challenges, I suppose it's good to know what's happened in other countries where, as Padraig mentioned, in 2014 it was adopted. So that's why we're very fortunate to be joined by Marion Eckhart, who is president of ELARD. And Marion, I might just invite you to give reflections on what you've heard so far and maybe share with us some of the experiences of other jurisdictions in Europe.
Thank you. I'm really happy that you invited me, and thank you for organizing an event just in time. It is really promising that also even the minister is here, so I think you have a good chance in Ireland in implementing the CLLD in the coming programming period. In this programming period, we have had 3,318 local action groups and fisheries local action groups in Europe, and only 788 have been using also regional and social fund. Those are mostly situated in Sweden, Czech Republic, Hungary, Romania, Slovakia, and Italy. Only 9 LAGs have been working with 4 funds. And my local action group is actually one of those. I was actually thinking of going to the conclusions that we have made, but it is actually the same impact that was already shared from Padraig. So I'm not going to go into that, but we have had a very good model for the beneficiaries in Sweden, actually, where we have had one managing authority. And this is the reason for success in Sweden, actually, that we have had one set of rules, one strategy that we have been putting in so that the local action groups have been able to actually use all these funds, because almost all local action groups in Sweden are multi-funded. Whereas in some other countries like Portugal, there have been different strategies for each fund, which has led to immense administration being put out on the beneficiaries. So I think it is a really good idea with this lead fund actually copying the model that Sweden has been doing. And I think a lot of countries are trying to pick that up now. But if I'm not going to talk about the impact on the local level of CLLD, I would like to bring up another thing, and what we have not mentioned yet, and it is the fact that I don't know, sometimes we are at the member state level talking about LEADER and CLLD, how we can bring more money to the local action groups, but I would advise the national level not to ask what you can do for CLLD, but to ask what CLLD can do for you. Because we are at the moment living in a Europe that is sliding apart, where democracy is taking beats, and we have a lot of populistic parties coming up, and they are especially strong in areas where people feel left behind, which are at places, some places, rural areas. And we have seen it on the European level, we have seen it on local level, and the answer of the European level, I think, to this, or some of the answers, are firstly, the long-term vision on rural areas that is in the process right now. It will be communicated in June, that we have been working out in a participatory process to see that we have a common vision where we want to go with the rural areas of Europe. And also what is going on now is the conference on the future of Europe, and both aim at bringing Europe closer to its citizens, which is a really important thing if we want to stay in this construct. So we see in the long-term vision on rural areas that we have immense challenges in some rural areas. We have the demographic change, we have people getting older, younger people leaving, we have high unemployment rates, failing basic infrastructure like connection to fast broadband, and so on. But in other rural areas, we actually have huge opportunities, because there are things that are good, that we have the possibility to develop the country or the area that we stay in, but we have maybe challenges such as housing shortages. Nobody can move there, even if it's attractive, because we don't have housing, or we have, because of that, we have lack of services as well. So we need local approaches in order to see what is the local development need in that very area. And that is then, of course, local development strategies. They take into account the challenges and opportunities of their own geographical areas. But, and then there is another thing. Now, when we are going to communicate the long-term vision on rural areas, the next step is to make it become reality. And there will be no new funding for that, but we will work with the funding that we already have. So it will be a huge responsibility for member states, actually, to adjust so that the rural citizens will take part of the tax money that they all pay into as well, to an equal part as the urban citizens. Because if we look on statistics, we see that maybe 10% of the EC funds are going to rural citizens, whereas we are 30% of the European Union. So it's too little. And we have now at the moment one tool that we know work to bring funding to the rural citizens, and that is LEADER. We have been existing for 30 years with some local action groups, and now to put into that the regional and social fund would be a very easy way to make the long-term vision reality. So for me, it's logical now. If we want to really support rural areas, we need to start with the tools that we have and not invent new ones. So that's my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you, Marion. And funnily enough, I guess I was trying to invent a new tool when we were talking about the people's transition work and TASC, which brought us back to the successes of LEADER and the potential of it for catalyzing other initiatives like community wealth building or you know, cooperative approaches to climate action. I think your point on the rise of potentially far right groups within Europe is key, because as we take climate action, as we go through that transition, how we do that is critical, because if we leave people behind, or if the transition is hurtful to people, it will catalyze a greater influx of disenfranchised people into those movements. So thank you very much, Marion. Finally, I just turn to Jack O'Connor. Jack is a member of the European Economic and Social Committee, as I mentioned previously, and he's recently published a report with that committee on an evaluation of CAP's impact on territorial development in rural areas. It's an excellent report, Jack, and it signposts some real opportunities around supply chains, around procurement, these ideas of kind of community wealth building that we're speaking about, and also the need for holistic approaches, which comes up over and over again in the conversation about CLLD. I wonder if you might be able to offer some reflections from your experience of compiling that report, and just maybe other reflections on what you've heard today, and how we might progress rural development across Ireland.
Well, thank you, Sean, and good morning, Minister and fellow panelists. Well, I must say that I greatly appreciated being invited to participate today, not so much for what I have to offer in the light of what I've heard from the previous speakers, but actually for the pleasure of listening to the previous speakers. I found it a very interesting discussion thus far, and I want to compliment TASC for the initiative. It struck me actually while the minister was speaking, when he was walking us through the various funding sources and activities across government, that the whole thing could do so much, could benefit so much from the idea of the one-stop shop, which subsequently surfaced in Pádraig Casey's contribution. Because no disrespect to the minister, but the thing that strikes you when it's presented in that way, which is the only way he could present it, is just how complex, labyrinthine, and rather inaccessible it all is. So I have to say that I'm an enthusiastic supporter, although not a campaigner, for CLLD, and I'm very much taken. I didn't think of it, I have to say, until I heard it ventilated by Pádraig Casey. I'm very much taken by the compelling case that he presented for CLLD as a catalyst for the mobilization of social capital in the idea of a national community-led recovery fund, which could be understood as one of the key instruments in the post-recovery transformation, which we should be challenging ourselves with taking. And in this regard, I want to echo what Marion Eckhart said about the importance of this kind of mobilization, which could be facilitated by CLLD in the context of a Europe in which whole sections of society in many countries, particularly among rural people, are alienated from the mainstream and increasingly attracted by. The only difference with Marion that I would have is I detest that term populist, which disguises the true character of the hard right. They should be called what they are. They're the hard right, and they include among their number neo-fascists. But I echo the point she made about the potential of a major mobilization of social capital to counter the threat posed by these people. They emerged in Europe, as we all know, in the 1930s, and things, and as somebody said, it didn't work out that well then. So I want to say, very much taken by this idea of CLLD as a catalyst for the mobilization of social capital. And I am very, very much taken by this idea of the National Community-Led Recovery Fund. Just to more coherently address your question, Sean, I was involved in the drafting of the information report. I was only, I would have to say, I was only a bit player on it. But one of the countries we reviewed was Ireland in the formulation of that report. And one of the things that struck me about it was that all we learned from our engagement with 14 organisations, including 2 government departments, and indeed TASC as well. Thank you, Sean, for making yourself available. What was more or less in accord with my own perceptions of the way it would work out. But one thing I learned, which I found quite dramatic and striking, and I didn't know, was that it is actually very difficult to get tangible empirical data on rural development, because there's loads and loads of data about counties and about regions and about industries that and economic activity which is associated with rural Ireland and the rural community, but actually the data that is available is data about counties and regions and so on. And of course, they all include large towns and in some cases even small cities. And one of the things we learned in the formulation of the information report is that this is not at all unique to Ireland. And that gave rise to our recommendation on the establishment of a rural development observatory. Because much of the data which is included in our report and in the technical annex is actually quite anecdotal, by reason of the way it had to be approached based on interviews, but also by reason of this problem around putting your hands on empirical data to inform policy making. And I would stress to all of you as an ancillary point, the desirability of promoting the establishment of a rural development observatory, upon which through which to facilitate the development of good information for policy making. Then otherwise, I mean, we did find, which is what would be your preconception anyway, that CAP is overwhelmingly within farm gate, that its contribution to rural development is really via the multiplier effect. The data on the multiplier effect is actually in Ireland now quite dated. I'm not saying it's not accurate, but it is dated. There was overwhelming support, not only in Ireland but in Europe for LEADER, and for the LEADER concept. But again, as we all know, it's very much the poor relation in terms of funding. Otherwise, the issue that achieved some prominence in terms of the contributions made by some of the organizations and interests we interviewed was the potential of the role of public procurement as a means of leveraging good practice, both in social and environmental terms. The public procurement amounts to about €2 trillion in the EU every year. It's about the equivalent, I think, of about 14% of GDP, which would be about between 7 and 8 times the value of the MFF and the RRF combined. And it's grossly underestimated as a tool. And of course, there are very powerful vested interests who have an interest in keeping it underestimated. and it would be very useful if organizations such as those who would be attending today were to pay to do more work in terms of highlighting the potential of public procurement and to promote local supply and environmental good practice and social good practice. The only other point I'd make, and it's my second last point, is around this question of the importance of paying particular attention to good auditing practice and particularly auditing of outputs, which of course is very challenging in terms of promoting any initiative, because there is a degree of skepticism about the trustworthiness, not in terms of people's integrity, but in terms of competence of community-led initiatives. But again, I want to finish by saying that I really am taken and totally supportive of this idea of the National Community-Led Recovery Fund, which has been articulated today by Pádraig, and of course using CLLD as the catalyst for that. So other than that, Sean, I don't have anything to add at present.
Thank you very much, Jack. I appreciate that thoughtful reflection on all that's been said, and the point on procurement is noted. In fact, this series of events started with Senator Alice Mary Higgins and the bill she was bringing forward around procurement, and an opportunity to, I suppose, provide space to have a conversation about that bill and the need to expand our definition of what the criteria around which we procure. We did hope to have time for some Q&A. We actually have run up, I think, first of all, I don't think there has been a load of questions jumping forward. I think people have been in listening mode and learning mode, like myself. There may be other ways we could facilitate a Q&A beyond this if people want to learn more information, to get in touch with us, and Pádraig and ILDM particularly, I'm sure would be happy to. But I might just, to close, say thank you, and I might turn to Minister O'Brien just for a final word if you would have time. Sorry I didn't tee you up for this, but I just on all you've heard, maybe just what your thoughts are.
No, it's been very interesting. I don't have a prepared closing thought, but I mean, it's been very much a learning exercise for me, to be honest, since the event was mooted. Can I take the opportunity to ask a question, maybe, because I would be interested, because in terms of my delegated functions here, I have more sort of oversight over ESF spending, but our ESF spending in this department is current expenditure rather than capital. And I'll throw this out, I don't know if it's true or not. Is it easier to run CLLD over capital expenditure rather than current expenditure is a question. If it makes sense, particularly Marion and Pádraig, you've probably more experience of CLLD.
Would either of you guys want to come in on that? Marion,
I'm sorry, but my language is a barrier. I don't know what is current and
okay. Okay, so we run a program here. It's the social inclusion program, and the majority of the expenditure on it is staffing, workers on the ground working with people who are in marginalized situations. But my knowledge of Leader is that much of the expenditure is what we call capital expenditure, making things, building things, improving infrastructure, So my question is it easier to run CLLD on that capital side of things, where things are more literally concrete and infrastructural? And is it more difficult to run CLLD on the current expenditure side of things?
I think both is possible, and I think we have different countries that are working in different modes. But Sweden, for example, where I come from, is a country where we work very much with people and we work much with processes and not so much in hard infrastructure. So there are lessons to be learned around different countries. Also, I know Austria is doing very well on that, and also Lithuania. So we can just have a talk about it if you need more details. Yeah.
Okay.
I might just allow Gabriel O'Connell to come in for a minute here, just to maybe field that question as well, Joe. He's one of our attendees, but a member of ILDNT.
Okay. Hi, Minister. Hi, panelists. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Look, just on the Minister's question there, yeah, I think it's a timely one, and it's something we're looking at in LEADER at the moment in terms of the simplified cost option, which the European Union makes available in all European funding. So it is a mechanism to deal with, to try and bring some simplicity into that very question, Minister. So that's something actually been worked on between ILDN and the LEADER side of the department at the moment in terms of the next LEADER program. I would just make a couple of general points, if I may, Sean, in relation to LEADER as well. I suppose currently we are working actively with the department around LEADER teams and sub-teams and possible actions for the next program period. And just for members' information, the European Commission have recently made recommendations to member states on the CAP and made specific policy areas that the CAP for each member state could look at. Now we've been working with the department on this, and we've just mapped that EU recommendation document against the LEADER method, where we can show the value of LEADER delivering on some of those policy areas. So we're being quite specific, and that will feed into what LEADER can do in the next LEADER program. We think there's value, and that model could be used across the other funds, because I'm sure the other European funds are also making similar recommendations to their managing authorities across member states. And certainly a mapping exercise could be done for CLLD against that. So that would be a good starting point to look at where the value of CLLD and the multi-fund could start to, integrate policy and bring a lot of the things together. Getting back to, what Pádraig said, really the value of integration is so obvious here. We're very lucky in Ireland at the moment to have significant channels of funding coming into rural areas, through a significant number of programs. So along with the Rural Regeneration and Development Fund, the obvious one, LEADER, is there, but we've town and village renewal, we have community enhancement programs, we've outdoor recreation infrastructure. In the border region, we have peace coming soon with significant funding, and that is terrific to get that funding. But what's missing is the integration. We have one fund, competing with another very, very often, and we're missing the value and the efficiencies of bringing the CLLD multi-fund approach there. So we would, in ILDN, really love to sit down with the department, with other policymakers, with TASC, to see how could we actually improve this? How could we improve the potential for local action groups, local development companies on the ground to deliver, in a more coordinated and integrated way? Thank you, panel.
Thanks a million, Gabriel.
I might just come in there as well, Sean, if you don't mind.
Please.
So it's just picking up on something Jack mentioned about the value of information. And I suppose LEADER is 30 years old this year. And I suppose, a lot of countries still struggle to present a cohesive argument that CLLD model is good value for money. And I suppose if you take LEADER, because it comes through an agriculture fund, there's no overall assessment of the value of that capacity building at a local level over time. And community development does take time and sustained commitment to do it. And I think the other value of introducing an integrated approach would be really to start looking at what are the key outcomes that we need to be auditing, and what is the value added that we need to be tracking over time, and generate that kind of information, because that is, Jack is right, that is certainly lacking. Yeah.
Thank you, Pádraig. I think there's some interesting questions coming into the in now, but we're really at time, so we're going to have to wrap it up. I just draw attention to Marion's response there to Richard in the chat, who asked what was the catalyst for Sweden moving to a multi-fund approach, and it was a case of the right person in the right place at the right time. So there's some of that, I guess, is worth remembering. And then Pauline's point about the importance to maintain a commitment to gender mainstreaming in all processes, very important. Guys, thank you very much. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to the Minister for joining us. I think it's a very informative conversation. Hopefully it's the start of a conversation that can build and who knows, maybe inform the decisions we make around the structural funds in the coming months. Thank you all, and I think we just sign off there. Really appreciate it.
All the best.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.